Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to create some press plate Christmas cards using the new Glad Tidings collection from Spellbinders and Simon Hurley. There's this ornamental registration BetterPress plate as well as the Santa Sleigh BetterPress plate and die set, and then the Nutcracker trio plate and die set as well. So I'm going to be using all three sets. I'm going to be adding a few other dies in to coordinate with them, but we're going to start out with using the BetterPress registration plate, the ornamental one. So every time you get a BetterPress registration set, it comes with this acetate piece that shows you exactly where each and every one of the pieces go. So I'm starting with the greenery, and I'm working on some BetterPress cardstock for this. I like the thickness of it. Sometimes I'll use other cardstocks when I'm doing different techniques, and I will use something different for the second card. But for this one, because we're just doing BetterPress and I'm not adding any other techniques to it, I'm just going to use the regular BetterPress cardstock. So I tape it to my clear plate, and then I'm using the Woodlands BetterPress ink set. This has a couple different greens in it that I really like. So I'm going to start with the lighter green, and then I'm going to ink up the entire greenery, and then I'm taking the darker one. It's called Spruce, and it's a little bit of a blue green, and I'm just kind of working my way from the center of the sprig and kind of flicking outward to get a little bit of color variation, just for a little bit of added interest. Put the clear plate onto the base, and then I'm putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And that's going to transfer and press that ink into that cardstock. And I love the fact that there's two different greens there, so we get some interesting looks. Next, I'm going to use the ornament part of the set, and I'm going to go with a non-traditional color palette. I've got three different distress ink pads here. I've got cracked pistachio, worn lipstick, and abandoned coral, and I want to make my ornaments so that they're a little bit darker at the top and a little bit lighter at the bottom. So I inked with the cracked pistachio, and then I took a large ink blending brush. This one's a Spellbinders one. It's nice and fluffy and soft, and I kind of just flicked a little bit up to lighten the ink on the bottom. You could also do a pouncing method, but because I kind of inked it clearly or evenly throughout the whole thing by flicking it up, I'm just getting a little lighter ink at the bottom. I am going to go back after I've done the other two ornaments and add a little bit more ink. For my second one, I'm using the abandoned coral. And I just inked the top of the ornament and then just did a pouncing motion with a different ink blending brush to make sure that I had light ink at the top, dark ink at the top and lighter ink at the bottom. I'm also using a damp cloth to make sure to remove any excess ink from that clear acetate template because I don't want that to transfer to my image. The third color I'm using here is the worn lipstick. It's the lightest shade. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm going at the top with the color and then pouncing to make it lighter towards the bottom. Putting that through my machine. And you could do this a couple times if you wanted to build the ink up. The one thing I would suggest though is you can see I have yellow tape on my base there. It's making sure that that gray mat doesn't shift in any way when I'm doing my better pressing. So if you want to do double or triple pressing, I suggest doing that just to make sure that nothing shifts. Once I did that, I didn't have any issues with my plates shifting at all. I added a little bit of that abandoned coral to the top of that lighter ornament just to darken that color. And then I also grabbed an Evergreen Bough distress pad and added some darker color towards the top of that first ornament just to darken that top as well. Now you could easily do just flat coloring here. That would work as well. Really personal preference. I just thought it would look a little bit more visually interesting to have some color variation to it. The last plate for this is the ornament tops as well as the chains. Now I want to do some silver embossing here. So I want to make sure that my embossing powder isn't going to stick to any ink that might still be wet on what I've already done. So I'm using an embossing powder tool to dust over that whole area to make sure that my powder is only going to stick to the VersaMark ink that I've put on my plate. I also use that same damp cloth to remove any excess ink that might have gone on the plate background. A little bit harder to see with VersaMark ink, but again, I wanted to make sure to have as much control over where that powder was sticking, and by using that damp cloth as well as using that embossing powder tool, I can do that. Then I can pour my embossing powder on that ink, pour off the excess, put it back into the container, and then use a heat tool to melt that powder. Now I'm using silver embossing to add some metallic, just to add a bit of different texture to this. You could do this with a regular ink. You could even do this with silver ink. I like using the embossing because not only does it add that metallic, but it adds just a little bit of extra texture to it. So to me, it looks a little bit more visually interesting. And that's as simple as this background is. It's really nice and simple, but it's a beautiful background. I'm going to take my guillotine trimmer here and I'm going to cut off 1/4 inch off of each side so that I can have a little bit of extra room to put a mat behind there before putting it on my card. I'm going to do all A2 cards for this video. So I have a white A2 card base. I used some Dahlia cardstock and that was cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And then my image piece there was cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Now I didn't do it for this one, but you could, if you wanted, add a sentiment to the front of this. The festive circle sentiments that I've used in a video recently would also work perfectly as a substitute for that circle ornament if you wanted to do that and make one of the ornaments into a sentiment. Again, I chose not to do that for this card. I wanted to keep it fairly simple. You can also stamp a sentiment on the inside of the card. To add just a little bit more sparkle, I'm using the Silver Mix gems, and I'm using mostly the smallest of the gems to put on some of the dots on those ornaments. I'm using a die pick to kind of pierce into the adhesive behind the ornaments to help place them onto my card, and then I'm using my finger from my other hand just to press that gem right down exactly where I want it to go. It's just going to add a little bit of extra sparkle, and I love the look of it. And that Silver Mix gem pack has 2 different variations in it. It has one that's a little bit more opaque and one that looks a little bit more transparent and sparkly. So with that one done, I can set that to the side and start working on my next card. And I'm going to use the Santa's Sleigh press plate for this one here. Now I'm working on some distress watercolor cardstock. I know I want to do some watercolor of my image, so I want to make sure that I'm using cardstock that can handle that moisture. Once again, I'm using VersaMark ink to ink up my press plates, putting that clear plate to the base and then running it through my Platinum 6 machine. For something a little bit different, for this one I'm going to use black embossing powder, but you could absolutely use a silver or gold metallic embossing powder here as well. That would look nice. I just wanted something nice and stark, and it just went a little bit better with what I had planned for this card. With all of that embossing powder on there, I can use my heat tool to melt it. Now I did use that embossing powder tool over there to make sure that I had control over where that embossing powder was going, to make sure it would only stick to my image and not towards or not on the background. Even though most of these images are being die cut, I wanted to make sure to have a clean embossing. So before doing any watercolor, I wanted to take the To All a Good Night sentiment and trim it, and I trimmed that with the guillotine trimmer, just doing it eyeball. It didn't need to be absolutely perfect, but it's easiest to do when my cardstock here is a full piece. What I did was lined it up in my trimmer with the bottom of the sentiment showing, and I tried to make sure that that was very even. Trimmed that and then flipped it around the other way and did exactly the same thing, making sure I had about the same amount of the making sure my strip was even basically, and not thinner on one side and thicker on the other. Then I'm going to use the dies that come in with this set, and I'm going to die cut my Santa Sleigh as well as the Merry Christmas. At first I was just going to do the Merry Christmas and then color or watercolor my Santa Sleigh while it was still on this cardstock piece, but I decided I might as well do my die cutting all at the same time. For my watercolor, I'm just using Distress refills here. It's one of my favorite ways to do watercolor because it's transparent. The colors are nice and dark, but you can add water to them and get them as light as you want them. So you've got a lot of control as well as color variation. I'm only going to use 2 colors for my watercoloring to keep it very simple. This here is Lumberjack Plaid. Since it's one of the newer colors in the Distress line, I don't actually have a well dedicated to it yet. I was waiting till the entire line was complete before redoing my palette, and I just haven't done it yet. It's clearly not a top of priority. For the sleigh, I'm using Walnut Sane, mainly because of the name. Because the sleigh in my mind is wood, walnut is wood, and it just kind of made sense. And then I figured I might as well do the deer in the same color, just so that I wasn't having two different browns here. So when I started with that first deer, you can see that it's really quite dark, but as I move along, the color is getting lighter because there's less and less color on my brush. Every once in a while, I'm going to clean off my brush, and you can see that I'm just going into that first deer and picking up some of the color from there. Not only is that picking up the color for me to paint some more, but it's also lightening that deer up a little bit. I don't mind if there's variation between the different deer there, but I didn't want one to be significantly darker than the others. So the water brush that I'm using has the water in the handle, so I always have a piece of paper towel to my right to clean off my brush between colors, to take off any excess liquid, and then I can easily go into my next color, and I have a little bit of control. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so having a jar of water to clean my brush would be like a disaster waiting to happen for me, so this works for me. I have my piece here on my Altenew sticky mat to hold it in place while I'm doing my watercoloring. Not totally necessary, but it's definitely handy to be able to have that in a stationary area and have it be stuck to there and not moving around. While I'm waiting for that ink to dry, I'm just using some gel pens to color in some of the accents with some metallic touches, just to give it a little bit of brightness. So I'm using a gold gel pen as well as a Stardust pen. I use the gold on the collars on the deer as well as the rails, or whatever you want to call them, on the sleigh. And then the Stardust one I'm using for the antlers for the reindeer. It's not going to add a whole lot of color, but it has a gold shimmer or sparkle, so it's just going to add a little bit of extra texture. Next, I'm using some stickles on the fur on Stance's coat and jacket and mittens, once again just to add a little bit of sparkle and a little bit of texture. And if I'm waiting for the paint to dry, I might as well also wait for the stickles and whatnot to dry. Finally, I used a little bit of pale gold Nouveau drops to add dots to the reindeer collar. There's some dots or circles drawn on them, and I think they're supposed to be like jingle bells. So I thought the Nouveau drops would add a nice amount of dimension to it. For the rest of my card, I wanted to add a little house and a tree, so I'm using some die cuts from the Simon Snow Globe die set as well as the Snowman Scene die set. So the tree is from the Snowman Scene die set. I liked it because it was a little bit bigger. You don't necessarily need to have a tree that's this big. There is some trees in the Simon Snow Globe die set, but for the look that I want, they were a little bit on the small side, and I already had this die set close by. So I'm going to add some gold behind the windows from the house, just to add that touch of gold as well. I always love when you have houses with windows that have a kind of golden look to it. Makes it look like the lights are on and stuff like that. I also use that same gold to die cut a circle for a moon. That die cut there is from the Sealed Poinsettia Stems circle. The circle die is from the Sealed Poinsettia Stems press plate and die set. You could use whatever circle die you have. This is just another one that I'd used recently, so it was close by and it was the right proportion. For gluing the pieces on my house here, I'm just using my reverse tweezers to hold those pieces while I put the glue on. And I'm using Bearly Art glue in a fine line bottle. It just gives me a little bit of wiggle room to shimmy things in place, but it sticks really well and starts to grab quite quickly. And I'm keeping the color of these fairly similar to the Santa and Sleigh. I do have a black chimney here and black trim around the windows, but the house is a similar red to the red that I watercolored for the Santa suit and stuff like that. So I have a green tree here. It's done out of furred cardstock, and then I'm using some bundled sage distress ink to do a little bit of light ink blending around it, just to add some visual dimension. Finally, I want to add some snowflakes in the sky, so I'm using the Sparkling Snow embossing folder and embossing a piece of Hammermill cardstock to go on the back of my card here. I really like the snowflakes in this embossing folder because they're a little bit smaller, so the proportion's a little bit nicer with the Santa and Sleigh as well as the house and the tree. So now that I have my background here embossed, typically when I do cards, I do rectangles upon rectangles in my layers. This one I wanted to do a little bit differently, so I cut off a half an inch from each side, so it's an inch narrower. It doesn't necessarily need to be each side, but I wanted to just see what was the right size, and I hadn't really decided to start out with. And then I'm taking my gold cardstock that I'm going to put on the sides, and I cut 2 1/8 inch strips. So this piece of this snowflake embossed piece here that I'm gluing onto the card is 5.5 inches by 3.25 inches, and then my gold strips here are 1/8 of an inch by 5.5 inches. So they're the same length, but they're just really narrow. You could put or do a mat behind your snowflake here, but this is a great way to make your cardstock go a little bit farther and not waste as much of the specialty cardstock by just doing it. You get the same look out of it, maybe not as much dimension because you don't have that cardstock behind the snowflakes there, but it just gives you the gold trim without using as much of the more expensive specialty cardstocks. So that matte gold cardstock is from the Treasured Gold cardstock pack. It is a pack of gold cardstock that has 5 different finishes to it. So it's great. You can pick and choose which one is going to work best for your project. I use that same gold cardstock for the circle for the moon as well as to go behind the windows on the house. I glued my tree as well as my house toward the bottom right-hand side. And I want to take a piece of white cardstock and create kind of a snowy hill for in front of the tree in the house. So I cut it about, I think it was about 1.5 inches wide, and then did the 3.25 inch length so that it was the same length or width as the snowflake embossed piece. Used my scissors to just cut a hill. And then I can glue that down. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit too high. I can glue it a little bit lower. And once that glue has set a little bit, I can take my scissors and just trim that down. I did adjust my house so it was in front of that hill. I didn't really want it to be behind it. Now that my glue has sat for a few minutes, it can be trimmed down to be even with the bottom of the card. So my sentiment strip here that I have to all a good night, I just laid that on the front of the card, and I liked the placement, but because I have my image piece narrower, I cut 1/2 inch off of each end to make it the 3.25 inches, and then I'm gluing it down here. Now I could have done my embossing with gold. That would have worked really well with it as well. I just wanted to make sure that my sentiments were nice and bold, so that's why I chose the black. Now I can glue down my moon as well as my sleigh. I didn't want to glue down the moon before I had placed the sleigh on there because I wanted to use that as a guide to where I wanted this to be placed. And you can see that both my sleigh as well as my tree go off of the center image piece, so they go outside of the lines. I really like that look at times, and it worked perfectly for this. Now, lastly, I glued down that Merry Christmas, and then I put a large acrylic block on there just to hold everything nice and flat while that glue was setting. For a little bit of sparkle on the snowy hill, I just added a little bit of a narrow strip of stickles as well as dots of stickle on my tree. And then finally, I wanted to put a little bit of gloss on those windows on the house. So I'm just adding some glossy accents in those openings. Just needs a tiny little bit. It's just going to give that a little bit more shine. Another option would have been to use mirror gold cardstock, but I wanted my golds all to be matching for all of the pieces for this card. And with that, this card is totally done. I love all of the texture and dimension you get between all of the different elements here. For the third card, I'm using the Nutcracker Trio press plate and die set. I am going to be doing this onto just BetterPress cardstock. I am going to be using the coordinating dies and cutting all of these pieces out. I'm going to just do some very simple coloring for this image with some Tombow markers. You could still do watercoloring if you wanted to do the same watercoloring as the last card, but I wanted to do something a little bit different and show you a few different ways that you can color these images. And just like you could do watercolor for this one like you did the last one. For the last one, you could color them with Tombow markers like I'm doing with this one. So there's definitely options when it comes to coloring things. For this one, I'm using some gold embossing powder and adding gold accent to my little nutcrackers as well. Now, when you die cut these pieces, they cut into 3 separate nutcrackers. You could use them to create 3 separate cards if you want, but I'm going to use them all on the same card. I'm just going to color them in different colors. Now for this one, I chose to die cut my sentiment out first and then color my nutcrackers. You don't necessarily have to. I just wanted to make sure there was no chance that I was going to get a little bit of ink onto that sentiment while I was coloring, and that's why I did it. Not really a right or a wrong way to do it. I could have also die cut my nutcrackers before coloring them, but I knew I wanted to add some glossy accents to some of the gold areas as well as onto their boots. And sometimes it's easier to have a larger piece of cardstock with that glossy accents. It helps to prevent it from curling. So I decided I wanted to color everything first, then put my glossy accents and stickles on, let it completely dry, and then do my die cutting. Firstly, I did a little bit of the gold accents with that same gold gel pen that I've used in the last card. And then I'm using some different Tombow markers. So this one here is 850. It's a nice light peachy pink color that I'm using for the faces. Then I'm using 772. It's kind of a dusty rose color. I dotted the cheeks with that. For my red Nutcracker, I'm using 847. It's a nice dark blue red. It's very similar to the crimson cardstock, and I really love this shade of red. I'm going in and just doing my coloring. By having embossed edges, it makes it very easy. The one thing you do want to do is once you're done your coloring, you should take a piece of paper towel and just kind of very simply blot it on there. Because that embossing resists the dye part of the Tombow markers, they don't actually ever dry on top of that embossing. So if by chance you have a little bit of marker on there and you touch it, you could smear some of that color onto your background. So by blotting it, you can eliminate that from happening. For any of the black accents, I'm using N25. It's just a nice dark black. You could even use like a dark gray that gives you that look of black, but it's not quite as stark. But because my lines here are gold because of that embossing, the black works perfectly. If you were to do this image in a black ink, that's when I would do the dark gray so that there's a little bit of a different color between the lines of the image as well as the details and that color. For my green Nutcracker, I'm using 249. It's a nice dark forest green. And then for the blue one, I'm using 565. Now, these are just dye-based markers. Any dye-based marker would do here. And you could even use these dye-based markers to do watercoloring. You could scribble them onto a non-porous surface and use that as a palette, and then use your water brush to pick up those colors if you wanted to have a watercolor look, but you didn't necessarily have like the distress reinkers that I used. This is another option. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is when you use dye-based markers to do watercoloring, you do dilute that color quite a bit. So your colors are going to be not nearly as vibrant as they are when you color directly onto the area. So I used the stickles for on the beards as well as some of the white trim. And then I'm using the glossy accents. I'm using it on all of the boots as well as the gold parts of the crowns. It's just going to add a little bit of a different texture. It's going to make that gold nice and shiny. And I always love using it on boots and black parts of like this, in this case, Nutcrackers or creatures, just to add that shine. The different texture just makes it look a little bit more interesting. So with these areas wet, you want to make sure that they are 100% dry before putting them through your die cutting machine. So I wait an hour before doing any die cutting. You need to make sure it's completely dry, because if it's not completely dry, if it's only dry in the surface and the inner part is still a little bit soft, the pressure of the die cutting machine is going to ruin your image. A way to completely prevent this is to die cut first and then do the stickles and glossy accents afterwards. Or, like I said, wait till it's 100% dry. I waited an hour and it was totally fine. I didn't have any issues. For the layers for this card, I'm using some of the dies from the Nested Tree Frame die set. I cut this piece here out of crimson cardstock, and then I cut one of the inner pieces out of white cardstock. This gold piece here is the matte gold that I've been using throughout the different cards here, and I wanted to have that as a matte behind my crimson piece. So I just used my ruler on my trimmer to see how big that piece was, and then trimmed this piece to be just a little bit bigger. I believe when I trimmed it, it ended up being 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So I have some nice even layers here. I didn't want my gold piece to be too wide and be too prominent, but I did want to make sure that it was bigger than this crimson piece and that I could see that gold through these little dots here. Using that same Barely Art glue for gluing everything together. putting it on the back there, adding just a touch or a dot on the edges of those circles. I want to make sure they're not going to catch on anything. And then using my acrylic block to hold everything down nice and flat, make sure all that glue has good contact here. And you can see by using liquid glue, you use very little when it comes to the glue. It's a great way to glue things together. It doesn't work as well on, say, ribbons and stuff like that, but for just cardstock to cardstock, it works perfectly. For my nutcrackers, I want them to pop just a little bit, so I'm using some foam dots on the back and making sure that I've got some good coverage on the back there. I want to make sure that I don't have any areas that are going to sag. So I'm doing, I think, probably about a half a dozen for each nutcracker. I have a ton of these small ones, so I don't have to worry about running out. I have a ton of them. So I'm using that for just the nutcrackers. The sentiment itself, I'm just going to glue down flat. You could also use foam pop dots for those as well to make them pop out, or make that sentiment pop out as well. But I wanted to make sure that those nutcrackers were the focus of attention. And by having all of them behind that foam tape, I can do that. You could even do, say, the center one just with the foam tape and then glue the other ones down flat for a little bit of a different look. I chose to pop them all up. So here is our third card here, our nutcracker card. I absolutely love the dimension as well as the texture you get from the stickles and glossy accents. Then we have our Santa sleigh card. Love it with that snowflake background on top of the house and trees. And then our ornaments. And this ornament one, you could use any color palette with this. I chose a non-traditional palette with those ornaments, but I think it would be great with those ornaments in metallics as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all of the time that you spend with me. Hope you have a fantastic day.